Hello, and welcome to the Huxley Speaker Series. I believe we're coming to you live. My name is Stefan Freeland. I'm the coordinator for the series this quarter. This being the first talk of the quarter, let me say very briefly, for those of you who are students, read the syllabus, watch the video, be logged in at 4:30 for Zoom attendance, and your first assignment is due on Monday. For those of you who are not students, well, you're welcome to turn in an assignment if you'd like, but mostly enjoy this talk. And we've got a whole series lined up, which you're welcome to join. They're Thursday at 4:30. They are all free and open to the public, and you can watch them on Zoom or on YouTube. For Zoom, you'll need to be pre-registered, and so the link for that and the YouTube information and the schedule and the sign up for the email list and the archival videos are all available on the speaker series webpage, huxley.www.edu/huxley-college-speaker-series. You'll find it with Google. For all of you, there'll be time for questions at the end of the talk today. Those you can submit questions via the chat, and we'll deliver those to our guest at the end of the hour. We recommend using speaker view and pinning the video to get for your settings on your end of the Zoom. I also want to thank the WW Alumni Association who are partnering with us to promote the talks this quarter. So those of you who are alum, welcome, and community members, great. If you have questions on any of that, you can email me. I am stefan@ww.edu. That all said, this quarter, our series focus will be the Salish Sea. We're partnering with the Salish Sea Institute. So today, to introduce our guest is Jenny Broadhurst, who is the director of the Salish Sea Institute. So I'll turn it over to Jenny. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stefan. As Stefan said, I'm Jenny Broadhurst, the director of the Salish Sea Institute. I want to just steal a minute and explain the Salish Sea Institute. Stefan's gorgeous map, which will come up on screen at some point here, is always a good place to start when we talk about the Salish Sea. It was created about the same time that the name, the Salish Sea, was adopted for all the waters, Puget Sound, the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and the Strait of Georgia in 2009. That map encourages all of us to recognize that it's one shared international ecosystem. Western Washington University created the Salish Sea Institute to raise awareness and protection for the Salish Sea. We bring people together from both British Columbia and Washington to share science and improve shared management of our shared waters. We also work on campus. In 2019, working with departments all across campus, we established the first ever multidisciplinary minor in Salish Sea Studies, and you'll hear more about that as the quarter goes on. It's important to recognize and appreciate that Western Washington University sits on the ancestral lands of the Lummi Nation and the Nooksack tribe. We're in the heart of the Salish Sea and in Coast Salish territory with deep history that's important for all of us to learn about. This quarter, we're excited to work in partnership with Stefan and Huxley College for this winter quarter series that focuses on Salish Sea issues. As he mentioned, it's a seminar class, but we're also really excited to have so much participation from community members. I'm honored to introduce Representative Sharon Shewmake, who's our speaker today. She's a professor of environmental economics, urban economics, and energy policy here at Western. She's written children's books utilizing her current experience as a mother of 2 young boys. She's active in many local issues, as well as serving in the Washington State Legislature representing the 42nd District. And for that work, that public service, I thank you very much, Sharon, for doing that. Representative Shewmake has a bachelor's degree in both economics and environmental science and policies from Duke University. She received her PhD in agriculture and resource economics at UC Davis. We're very excited to have her with us today, and I'll turn it over to Representative Shewmake.
Thank you all. And I am going to screen share and make sure that, yeah, we got it working, this beautiful title slide. So it's really excited to talk to you all. But I also want to acknowledge that yesterday and today have been really difficult days for our nation and for a lot of our students, for a lot of our alumni and community members as well. So it was a tough news day yesterday. I mean, frankly, it's been a tough 4 years of news days, and it's not like the world was perfect before that, right? So I redid a little bit of these slides, which means there's going to be more typos. to take away some of the graphs that I usually show in light of what happened yesterday, I wanted to make this a little bit more personal. So we look at this when we think about climate change. It's always really depressing, right? And I like to go to the far side. If you guys remember that cartoon, a lot of you are probably too young, but the picture is pretty bleak, gentlemen. The world's climates are changing, the mammals are taking over, and we all have a brain about the size of a walnut, right? And so the dinosaurs were in a worse situation from us, but we can get through bad political leaders. We can make mistakes. We can address climate change. And we should have done it 30 years ago. We should have done it earlier, but we can still do that. We have big brains. We can work together. And that brings me to this next slide, where I was thinking about politics as people. And as an economist and a nerd and someone who really feels at home in a spreadsheet or looking at a data set, acknowledging that politics is people and people have all the imperfections, whether they're people in Congress, people in the legislature, your professors, your partner, my kids are screaming outside my door. We're all imperfect, right? And so when we realize that politics is really about people, we're going to make mistakes. Sometimes things get violent and angry, and we have to work through that. We would, just like I don't want my kids to get violent and angry, and I'm trying to teach them not to. We deal with this with our political system as well. We've made these mistakes in policy and using science. I mean, you look at eugenics, you look at climate denial, you look at bad health policy, including how we talked about tobacco. We make mistakes when we devalue people, when we put one group above another. Sometimes one of the things that's really struck me in the legislature that I've learned over and over again is that we're all subject to our biases. And sometimes I think that's really the difference between the two parties, or the Republicans and the Democrats, when you get down to the people aspect of it, is that the Democrats, I kind of joke that they always want to throw money at a problem, but they want to solve problems. Whereas the Republicans are a little reluctant to go ahead and make big changes, right? And so when you look at the parties that way, we can get really down in the dirt, and we can have bad sides. I'm not going to say we have our foibles, and we need each other to check in place. But once you realize that these are biases and that we can understand biases and we can use social sciences to work through those, and you realize also that ideas often need to be socialized, right? And when we talk about that, conversations really matter. So these conversations that I have with you, that you have with your family, that you have during a political campaign, when you're trying to get people to vote for you or vote for an initiative, or when you're in a political sphere and you're trying to get people to support a bill or groups to support a bill. Sometimes one of the things that I've learned over and over again in Olympia is that sometimes people will oppose things just because you didn't ask them about it beforehand. And sometimes people will agree to do things that seem to be against their best interests because you asked them and you brought them along with it. You identified the problem and you said, okay, we're going to find all the ways to try and make this better. And some of those ways may impact you in ways you don't like. You might have to pay for some of this. But if people feel that they're included in that, it's not as bad always. Sometimes they still oppose it and we still have thorny questions, but these conversations really are impactful. And another thing that I've really learned is that one person can make a difference. And as someone who's devoted her life not to making tons of money or running a really fast mile, I'm a terrible runner. But instead of trying to make a difference, it's hard to think that one person is making a difference. And it's hard to see, especially when I came up with this talk, I was thinking about all my students, and I was thinking about what it was like to be a college student and feeling the world is so full of promise and ideas are so big and fascinating, and where do I fit in? What can I make? And so one of the things I wanted to do, one of the things that I changed what my talk was going to be about before, was I wanted to tell you about my story. And so we're going to start off with awkward high school Sharon. So this is the woman in front. This is the picture I could find on my laptop. So you can see my mom and my brother and my friend Charlotte. And there is awkward high school Sharon. We're at the airport. I think Charlotte's going back to France. And so I went to college wanting to be a scientist. Chemistry just made sense in my head. It had answers, it had solutions, there were numbers that guided things, and I really liked that. And when I went to college, I didn't actually get into the chemistry biology first year program that I wanted to get into. It filled up too soon. And I ended up in the environmental one. And I realized that I loved the environmental one and that I hated field work. I hated lab work. I hated field work, whether it was washing glassware or measuring trees or pulling out weeds. I just hated it so much. And it didn't matter if I got to go visit beautiful places, I hated it. And so one of the things that brought me to environmental policy work and environmental economics was that it allowed you to learn about science without actually having to go and measure things out in the real world, right? Like I could measure things that people were doing and I could interact with people. And as I went through college, I realized that that's absolutely what I wanted to do, but it's not the only way to have that difference. And so in college, before I went, I used to think that college professors were wizards, right? I didn't know any college professors socially. It wasn't until I got to college that I knew them. And then they were these fancy people that stood up at the front of the classroom. And I thought that maybe you had to be born into a wizard family or a college professor family to become a college professor, but you don't. And I really want to encourage those of you who think this is what you want to do to go ahead and come talk to me afterwards, and or also talk to the professors in your field, why you want to do a PhD or why you think you want to do a master's. It's not the right thing for everyone. It's not something that you should do just because you love school, but it's something that I think should be more accessible. Because when we think about who is researchers, if they're all coming from the same families, if they're all coming from positions of relative privilege, we're going to miss a lot of really important topics. And so we really need that diversity, especially in the social sciences, to better understand our world and to come up with political solutions, to come up with policy solutions, to come up with economic solutions that are more effective because they're guided by this variety of viewpoints. So I'll tell you my story. You guys heard a little bit of my bio. So I did my undergraduate at Duke, and that's when I realized I wanted to be a professor. I actually worked for 2 years in DC, but I'm not going to draw that cute little airplane. I went to UC Davis, and when I was at Duke, I thought I wanted to study something on fisheries or ecology. And the more I worked at UC Davis, the more I realized that what I really wanted to study was climate change, and that I really wanted to find ways to better address the climate crisis. And I focused on research that allowed us to evaluate policies that reduce CO2 emissions that aren't necessarily cap and trade or carbon pricing. And I love cap and trade or carbon pricing. It's just economists study that a lot. And I wanted to look at all these other policies that we were actually using, that were in much more use, and see if they were working the way we said they were working. My next trip was at Vanderbilt University. I worked at a law school. And then until then, after that, I got to come to UC Davis. And so when Western Washington University here in Bellingham. I was reading UC Davis on my screen. So when we talk about research and teaching and policy, I like to think about, well, what do those really look like as someone who's engaging in them? As students and as alumni and as other people, you might know what a college professor looks like from the dais, but what does it look like from our position? What kind of a job is it? And how do you feel like you can really address deep problems there? And I want to talk with teaching first. Teaching is really fun, and Western students make it really fun. This is my favorite place that I've taught of all those places on that. I feel that students really care about the world. They really are engaged. When I make a mistake on their exam, they don't get super mad at me. They say it very politely, which I appreciate. And they're really interested in the bigger picture. And it's that bigger picture in teaching that is just so much fun. I get to teach environmental economics. I teach a class on the economics of climate change, urban economics, and broader energy policy with some interactions with food policy. And what's so cool about teaching is you come from an area that you roughly know things in. So I roughly know most of economics. Don't make me talk about macro too much. And then you get to go to an area that maybe you haven't done research in, and you get to learn with your students, and your students ask questions and you don't know the answer to that. And so you all go together and you learn about it, and your students get you super excited about new policies that you hadn't really thought of. And then they go off into the world and they learn more things and they come back to you. And it's just this really lovely way to keep your mind engaged, keep yourself engaged. And it gives you this larger sense of purpose. Working with young people, empowering them, getting them excited about things. There's so many reasons that being a professor is an awesome job, but I really think that's the main reason why. Research is also a really interesting endeavor. So I personally strive to do research that's relevant. And new scholars do research that is very, very narrow. So when you start off doing research, and I'm not at the stage where I get to do the broad, history of everything research, but new scholars tend to do things that are, they try and pick off a topic that's bite-sized. Well, it's still going to take you, possibly 4 years to write that paper. They tend to follow things that others have done. And so my research was on evaluating policies to reduce CO2 emissions that aren't cap and trade or carbon taxes, right? And we know these policies, these secondary policies, sometimes they're necessary. Economists will sometimes be derogatory and they say they're the second or third best or even 10th best policies. But they're important things to analyze. And the more we learn about, the more you dig into climate policy, the more you realize that it's not just unpriced CO2, but it's also all the other distortions in the market that allow for excess CO2 production, that there are ways that we could cut carbon costs that aren't going to be gotten at with just a cap and trade or a carbon tax policy. And that's what I think is really exciting. But sometimes it's also because the politicians don't have the nerve. So one thing that I work on is do HOV lanes reduce congestion? So that was some of my research, and I still have a paper that I need to finish at some point. And so HOV lanes are carpool lanes, and we build them ostensibly. The reason that we say they build them is to improve air quality and to get people to drive less by incentivizing the reason to carpool. They may not actually do that. And that's kind of some of the research that I'm doing is, well, do they actually do that? Like, is this a policy that seems like it was politically acceptable and that we adopted because we couldn't do what the economists said what we should do, which is we should tax roads more. I also look at how people think about energy efficiency in the housing market. So I have some research with Professor Dorsey Palmatier and Professor Thompson, where we are looking at, if you sell your home and it's a little bit more energy efficient than a comparable home, do you get a price premium for that? And that's really important, because if you're thinking about adopting a new water heater that maybe doesn't make your home super exciting the way the granite countertops does, or redoing the bathroom does, is the person that you sell the home to, are they going to be willing to pay a price premium for that energy efficiency? Is that something that's valued by the market, or is that something that's only valued by you? And so you're only going to think about the tenure that you're going to use that, right? And so as I've been in this role, I've been thinking a lot about the interaction between research and policy, right? So as a researcher, I want to do policy relevant research. And as a policymaker, I really want the policy that I work on to be grounded in research. And so ideally, these two things, they talk back and forth to each other, right? The researchers talk to the policymakers and the policy makers talk to the researchers. And I can tell you that when I was a researcher, that never once happened. Policymakers never came to me. They were not amazingly reading my papers in Journal of Environmental Economics, whatever, right? And as a policymaker, I rarely have time to dig into the academic research. And when I do, it's not something that I think most of my colleagues are really getting into. We're more likely to read summaries of that research or be briefed on that research. And so I think that it's not quite this nice little back and forth as we might think. So I wanted to talk about it in what I work on, which is climate change. And the research might come up with the Keeler curve. Some of the people who are doing James Hansen, climate change is going to damage our way of life, and it's something worth addressing, right? And so that's what the science could come up with. The science comes up with, this is the impact of CO2, and this is what we're worried could happen to the climate. And that's going to lead the policymakers to think that we should do something. And they're going to use their values to kind of make that decision, right? They're going to hear that science and they're going to think about their values. And there's values that's the reason that we elect them, right? We elect people to represent our values and make those tough decisions. Economists are very clear that we should be doing this with a price on carbon. So this is particularly on a carbon tax that rebates the money back to folks. But I think most economists would support either a cap and trade system or a carbon tax. But what we want to say is we want to say that we want to price carbon. Putting a price on carbon is the cheapest way to reduce CO2 emissions. You can use either a cap and trade system where you cap the total amount of emissions that you want and you give everyone permits that allow you to emit a certain amount of CO2. So you get a certain quantity of CO2 that's allowed to be emitted each year. Or you can use a carbon tax, which is right now the reason we pollute too much is it's free to pollute. And so if we made it more expensive to pollute, we'd get a little bit less pollution. You can also use subsidies. Subsidies are a little bit less effective. So you can pay people to pollute less. And they're a little risky. You have to be really careful about the design of them. There's a lot of unintended consequences that can happen with subsidies. And another real problem with subsidies is that when you subsidize producing something that's less pollution, you're making it also, let's say that you're going to subsidize something that's like a greener version of something that's polluting. Well, now what you're doing is you're increasing the profits in that polluting industry. And so that can lead to unintended consequences. But generally, these market-driven solutions, the reason they're so effective is that they send a signal to companies to cost effectively reduce carbon emissions, much in the same way that prices work to encourage companies to be efficient in their operations, right? So if you're a builder and the price of wood goes up, you figure out ways to use a little bit less wood, and maybe you look at using a little bit more concrete and other materials. And this is similar to the way that we want people to be thinking about their pollution. We want them to be thinking about, okay, well, the price of pollution is high, maybe I should figure out a way to pollute a little bit less. And that's a really key important mechanism. Another important thing is that they're cost effective. So this is it's commonly known as the McKenzie curve. And what this is what some engineers went out and they looked at all these different ways that we could cut CO2 emissions. And so along the x-axis, the width of these different bars, so this would be low, this one would be solar PV, right? And this is old, we don't do this so much anymore. I just think it's useful for understanding how economists think about this. So it could be solar PV. There's so many gigatons that you could emit. And then you look up on the y-axis, and that's about the price per ton of CO2 abated. So this is in euros. So it would be about 20 euros per ton of CO2. And again, this is an old curve. And so if what we do, we put a price on pollution. Yes. If we say that we want to have only 30 gigatons of CO2 per year, we're going to put a line on right there. And then we're going to say, okay, well, in that case, we want to abate 30 gigatons of CO2 per year, then we're going to give out we're going to give out enough permits so that we want to see this abatement, and this will be the price of those permits, right? So that's how we would do it with a cap and trade type of system. Alternatively, we could put a price on carbon. We could say, okay, well, we're going to make you pay, I don't know, what is that, $30 per ton? And then firms are going to think, okay, well, now I have to pay to emit my CO2 emissions. If there's something that I can do that's cost effective to avoid having to pay that permit, I'd rather do that. So if it only costs me $5 to reduce my CO2 emissions, it's better to pay $5 than to pay this $30 per ton tax. I'm going to go ahead and do that. Now, suddenly this pencils out and this makes sense to do from an economic perspective. And so in that way, what we do is we're able to do all the things on the left first. These are all the things that are cost effective to do and that get done before we start to do the really expensive stuff. And if you think about the problem of CO2, we use it in so many aspects of our life. And so we're probably going to still be emitting some well into the future, and hopefully we can get to some sort of net zero where what we emit, we sequester in other places. But ideally what we do is we do the easy stuff first. We do the low hanging fruit, and then we'd only do as much of the really difficult, expensive stuff until we're no longer able to sequester, right? And so it's that balancing that becomes really tricky. Like if you've ever tried to figure out how to reduce your own carbon footprint, it's hard to do the calculations, but then you're also thinking about, well, I really enjoy my Sunday burgers, but I could ride my bike more. And so you kind of do this in your own life too, when you try and think about, well, how do I reduce my impact? How do I, just like you might diet or you might do all sorts of other things, right? You try and figure out, well, what are the things that are easiest for me to give up? And that's what we want to do on a social aspect, on a social scale as well. And so these two tools, cap and trade and carbon taxes, they have been used. They've been used successfully in CO2 emissions. They've been used successfully in other emissions as well. So Europe has an emissions trading scheme. And when I made these slides, that was about 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions. They set a goal to reduce its emissions 20% from 1990 levels by 2010 using the ETS. And if you look at right about where they're trying to get, they're getting close to where they want to get to their goals. But what's really exciting is we look at this decoupling. So historically, as we've seen CO2 emissions increase, we've seen GDP increase as well. And so for us to have more production and make more money, do we have to release CO2? And the answer is no. And Europe has showed this, that their GDP has increased 50% since 1990. So this is from 2015, while their greenhouse gas emissions have decreased. And so that's the difference between the blue line and the red line, but also the greenhouse gas intensity. So this is the CO2 per dollar of output has decreased even faster than that. And so it is possible to continue to have economic growth without cutting our carbon emissions. And from when people started talking about climate change when I was in class, this was when I was a student, this was not obvious. When we talked about what does a sustainable future look like, I always thought it would have to be, we would all wear, you know, like maybe one outfit, and we wouldn't be able to have carpets and beautiful buildings and all of these things. And so this has been really a demonstration that we can both protect our planet and have economic growth. And in fact, climate action is pro-economic growth, that we need to have some controls on our CO2 emissions if we want to avoid some of the devastating impacts of climate change. And when we've looked at this on a macroeconomic impact, we don't see macroeconomic impacts of carbon pricing. That when countries enact a carbon tax or when they enact a carbon trading system, we can't detect the fact that we can't see whether or not they're having an impact on jobs overall. And we don't see impacts overall in a decrease in GDP or output, right? And that's another really good story, that if you do this right, you can do this in a way that it might have industry impacts, but the economy overall, you don't really see a net impact. Another, the other policy that economists favor is a carbon tax, and our neighbors to the north have one of those. And so this is from the British Columbia government. They have a carbon tax brochure that I found, and they put it really simply as tax the pollution we do not want and return the money for what we do want, money in people's pockets, jobs, and investments. So when you put a tax on carbon, the point is to make polluting more expensive, but the secondary impact is that you actually raise money. And so you can use that money for all sorts of things. British Columbia decided to give it back to people in dividends. There's some programs in the US Congress to do that. I'm working on some legislation that would use this for economic recovery. So we would be able to bond some of the money and be able to use it on green infrastructure projects that we also know we need to do. From an economics perspective, I think a lot of economists prefer the dividend approach as a way to also make the tax system a little bit less regressive, make carbon taxes a little bit less regressive. But there's also some strong reasons that you might want to spend that money on some of the green infrastructure as well. So British Columbia's tax on carbon started off low. It's steadily increasing. It's still not going to be high enough to where we think it needs to be to get to net zero. But they also have been able to decouple, right? So we've seen their GDP grow faster than the rest of Canada, their population grow, but their greenhouse gases have decreased over time, right? And so it's really hard to detect what that greenhouse gas emissions reduction has done, because you have one country or one province and a whole lot of other things are happening. So the literature is a little bit mixed on that, but that's more how difficult this is to measure than necessarily an indictment of carbon taxes or cap and trade or carbon pricing. So the BC Environment Minister said it performed better on all fronts than any of us expected, to the extent that people who modeled it predicted this. I'm not sure those on the policy end of us really believed it, right? So, and this is something that we've also seen, is that when we've used economic instruments to address pollution, whether it be climate change or SO2 trading, it's often been better than what we expected, that our predictions were a little too cautious, a little too conservative, and that when you give an economic incentive to firms to go out and innovate and find new ways to cut pollution and make money cutting pollution, they open up avenues that we never would have thought were possible, right? And so that's one of the really exciting things to think about when we think about is, well, how do we get the incentives right? And I would argue that climate change is a really great example of that. So back to my model of how policy and politicians, or how research and politicians can interact with each other. We have this climate change is going to damage our way of life. The politicians go, we should do something. And so they go back to the scientists, and I'm going to include economists and scientists. That's controversial. Economists are going to say tax CO2 emissions. And it's more difficult than that. They actually need to talk to other scientists to figure out, well, not just CO2, but other greenhouse gases, and how do we compare them? What are good ways to sequester them? Lawyers have a whole lot of work to do on how to do it. We have to define an entire new industry of carbon accounting. We need to refine these tax principles. There's a ton of work over in this little cluster of blues. And then they go back and the politicians go, find us something more politically palatable, right? So that's actually a difficult thing to do. Carbon taxes are not particularly, they've been a difficult pill to swallow, at least in the United States. And so there's kind of this back and forth again of, well, maybe they go to social psychology research to understand how people think about energy. Well, meanwhile, they've been doing all these other regulatory reforms as well. And so it's not just the politicians, but there's labor interests, there's nonprofits, there's equity and class conflicts, there's business interests. And so you have all these groups of people trying to work with the researchers and trying to figure out these different threads. And it's just this fascinating mix. And there's these roles for so many of the young people that I'm speaking to, the alumni that I'm speaking to, in not just the research and the government, but we also need labor leaders, we need business leaders, we need people that are doing organizing around the environment, but also organizing in a social context as well to help people understand and link the threads of energy use and their health, their livelihoods, what they're experiencing. So economists tell the politicians to price CO2, and we also have this kind of political dynamic, right? So the people over here in this blue, they're saying, okay, we'll do this even if some people don't really like it. But then there's also kind of this red dynamic that, no, it's too hard and our business interests don't like it. And there are jobs in the fossil fuel industry that don't want to change, right? And this is the simplistic way that we see it, right? Like, well, you have Democrats versus Republicans. Democrats want to do it, Republicans don't. But it hasn't always been that way. And it's not always that clear cut. So one of the allies on the Democrat side is the labor, and some of the labor interests are really worried about the job impacts if you have people working in fossil fuel industries. And I'm worried about those too. Those are good jobs. Those are people I care about. And so it's not just pricing CO2, but we also have to figure out, well, what are we going to do about these job impacts? How are we going to, how are we going to work through those as well, right? And so to go to that, I'm going to say that, well, pricing hasn't always been the solution, right? We have regulation, we have fuel efficiency standards, and fuel efficiency standards tend to be a lot more expensive though, per unit of CO2 reduced. CAFE for about I want to say that for a ton of CO2 emissions that are reduced from the CAFE standard. So those are fuel efficiency standard for vehicles. It costs about $80 to $125 per ton. And so that's pretty expensive CO2 emissions going through that regulation route. We have subsidies for green cars or green energy. We have renewable portfolio standards, which are basically a standard for utilities. We've seen mandates on technology saying that you have to even get rid of technology that's too inefficient, and sometimes these can be cost-effective ways to do it. We'll see bans on particular uses of fossil fuels. And then another big one is research on green R&D. So economists aren't always a big fan of the regulation. We used to be kind of against it. Now we're kind of starting to see that it can be really complementary to carbon pricing. And it can be a way to incentivize development in new technology. But also research on green research and development is another really key component. That's another one of the things you need to do in addition to pricing carbon. And the reason the research and development dollars are so important is we have the cost of green energy relatively high because we haven't had it as much. It's coming down. It's come down a lot, actually. But if you think about where we are with the dirty energy, we've been doing that for a long time. And so we've been continually innovating on that. And so we have many more years of innovation on coal-fired power plants and natural gas than we do on wind turbines, and then we do on solar panels, and we do on, algal biofuels. And so doing that research and development on the green R&D is important for bringing down the costs here, but it's also important because you think about climate change as something that is a multi-country strategy, right? We have to work with Bangladesh and Malawi and Europe and Russia. And so if we can do research on green research and development, and we can bring down the cost of wind power, as we saw the world kind of did together, it would jump from country to country where that research and development was going. Then that's something that can be easily exported to countries that may not want to switch away from the cheaper fossil fuels, but they're willing to switch to an even cheaper renewable fuel, right? Another piece that we see when we talk about climate change is that energy impacts so many of the ways that we live, right? And so it's not just that there's that, we call it an externality, the CO2 emissions, that they're causing external impacts, but we also have network externalities. So you think about when you get in your car, and it's a gasoline powered car, you know that you can drive almost anywhere and you won't have too hard of a time finding a fueling station, right? Like that you can drive to Nevada and you might have to stop a few times to be able to fill up, but you're confident that you'll be able to find that. And we don't quite have that for electric vehicles yet. You have to do a little bit more planning. It's there, but you have to do more planning. And there's also the infrastructure in our cities isn't always set up for that. So I live in a house that's, you can see it, it's over 100 years old, and I don't have a dedicated parking spot. So if I really want to get an electric car, but I don't know where I would charge it without a dedicated parking spot. So we need to figure out some of those infrastructure pieces as well. But we also need to think about how we build our cities, right? So that's also part of the next network externality, is that we've built cities that are focused around getting around with cars. And they're not necessarily focused on getting around by foot or getting around by transit or getting around by bicycle. And so when we built them for cars, it means that people are taking cars, and it's going to be, you're going to have to get a certain number of people to switch to bicycles, walking, and transit. And you're going to have that good infrastructure there, or else they're not going to switch. And so you kind of have that chicken and that egg, where you start to build it out so far, and now everyone wants to use that one technology and they don't want to switch to another technology, and that becomes more difficult. So we have to price pollution, but we also have to think about the research on the green research and development. We also have to think about the network externalities and fundamentally the way we build our cities. So I have this picture of Atlanta and Barcelona, and they have really similar populations, but really different carbon productivity. And so you can look at the built up area of Atlanta versus Barcelona. I mean, the same populations are in both. And when you look at the transport of carbon emissions, 7.5 tons of CO2 per person in Atlanta versus 0.7 in Barcelona. And so it's that compactness of the city and where you live, that's also a really key component. And that's something that we really have to solve together, right? That's not something that you can individually do on your carbon footprint. It's something that you have to talk to your city council, and your city council has to talk to your county council, and they have to talk to these planners. And so it's a really, there's so many people involved, and part of that research and that policy, it's not quite just the researchers are talking to the policymakers and back and forth, but we have all these other people that are in between as well, and a lot of planning that goes involved, and a lot of private investment as well. And so policy and research aren't the only areas where you make these big changes. So this summer I read this really fun book, Superpower, that is the story of Michael Skelly, who was a businessman. And he works a lot on wind energy, and he wanted to build an electric connection from Oklahoma to Memphis to take some of this cheap wind energy and bring it to Memphis. And this story is, I'm a big energy nerd, but it was this fascinating story about how do you get through all the different levels of regulation to get that wind energy all the way to Memphis. And that's leadership, right? So when we talk about the areas that you make big changes, there's the policy and the research and the politicians, the people that get the politicians elected, and the nerds at the university like myself. But there's also a lot of business interests that are also just a really key component of it and a really key partner. And one of the things that's happened in the last years, BP has been in favor, British Petroleum has been in favor of carbon pricing for a while, but this year Phillips 66 has also come out in favor of a carbon tax. And this is a really big difference from where they were with the last carbon initiative, right? Where they spent a lot of money taking it down. And this has been leadership. So maybe this will be the year that we see comprehensive carbon policy pricing, whether it's a carbon tax or cap and trade. I think that would be fantastic, but this is really big news. And it's not just refineries that do things, it's people working for refineries, people in that leadership. And so when our students here that are, oh, I'm an environmentalist, I don't want to go work for a refinery, you should absolutely go work for a refinery. You need to understand the historic energy system that we're working on, but also we need people like you making these arguments that this is what we need to do to go forward. We need this forward thinking, and we need this recognition. It's not selling out, it's working within the system. And I think that's really, really important. We need green builders. We need green manufacturers. We need green cities council members, and we need farmers that want to experiment and sequester carbon, right? So it's not just the policymakers, the researchers, the nonprofits, but there's also, we need people that are thinking about climate change from a business perspective as well. And that's one of the reasons I think it's always really fun to work with the business and sustainability majors, is that I learned so much back from them on green marketing and accounting. And that's such a key component of how do we address this continuing to grow our economy while reducing our carbon footprint. We also can't have good policy without organizing. Elections are how we make decisions about big things, and it requires more than just voting once every 4 years, right? It requires engagement. It requires engaging others as well, and creating a common framework and language around how we talk about difficult questions. So it I was reading about the history of the post office, and what was so fascinating was the history of the post office was actually America was really innovative in starting this post office. And one of the reasons they did that is they wanted to send out cheap newspapers that allowed people to understand the issues, or at least trust their leaders in understanding the issues. And that was an important component of having a democracy, is that we're all on the same page. And that becomes really complicated when we talk about tricky scientific questions. And so I always bring this up to my students. It's old too. This is from an old slide deck, but it's scientific versus public consensus. And we look at adults versus AAAS scientists, and these are the top scientists. And climate change is a big one. So that's the one at the bottom. 50% versus 87% say it's due to human activity. And that has gone up a lot in the more recent polls. But also GMOs. Right. And that's something that, maybe our liberal side is some of the people that are worried about GMOs, and the AAAS scientists aren't. Another thing that I bring up are childhood vaccines. Right. So we also have people that are much more hesitant about using the vaccines than the AAAS scientists, who, 98 or 86% of them think that they should be required, not just that they're safe, but that they should be required. And so when we think about this, I'm going to bring in another area that's really important to understand, and that I hope some of you guys all think about, and that's understanding misunderstanding, and understanding motivated reasoning as a means to a predetermined end. I think we're seeing some of that, and we're feeling some of that when we see people go, protest at the US Capitol and cause problems, and criminal actions. Confirmation bias. I think we're seeing a lot of confirmation bias, and that's part of this split that we're seeing in our nation right now, is that we only believe the facts that we learn from our media sources, and we don't spend enough time listening to the other media sources, or at least trying to understand where people are. But it's also important to recognize that we have goals other than just being accurate about our beliefs, right? Like we care about our communities, and we want to feel accepted and a part of our communities. So when you look at the other side and you think, how on earth can they believe that, X causes Y? Remember, they're probably in a community where a lot of those people believe X causes Y. And when I'm having to ask people for votes and bringing people together on a campaign side, I spend a lot of time talking to people about their values. And I find that when we get down and we talk about our values, we don't actually disagree as much as we think we do. Even on things like Black Lives Matter, which, for some people, they think Black Lives Matter is destroying the family, whereas in my neighborhood, you can't, throw a rock without hitting a Black Lives Matter sign. Everyone believes Black Lives Matter in my neighborhood. And so I think a lot of this has to do with organizing, with understanding, and with better discussions. And am I close to where I need to be? Am I running out of time? I have like a few more slides.
Yes, we're running out of time, but it's great information. So wrap it up and good.
Do you want me to shut me up in like 4 minutes? So how do we then generate better beliefs, right? And so this is this discussion of framing and understanding how people think about the world. And if you've never read this book, Don't Think About an Elephant, it's the second edition by George Lakoff. It's a great thing to read, even if you never read another book about linguistics or framing. And the piece of this that really struck out to me was when he spoke about how we see the world, the political system, through our family. And if you're a conservative, we do both of these, right? We all have strict father families and nurturing parent father families, but the conservatives are more likely to appeal to the strict father family, where the father protects the family, supports the family financially, and teaches kids what's right from wrong. Whereas the nurturing parent, and I am totally a nurturing parent, you will see this when I interact with my kids, parents empathize with the child to meet its needs and have these two-way discussions with the child, right? And so the nurturing parent perspective thinks that you teach respect and compassion by example, whereas with the strict father family, he sees it, it's the father, not the mother, the strict father family, not the parent. You have to use of force. It's necessary for good children, because without discipline, your kids won't be moral. They'll never learn to work hard. And so they'll always be poor, and you can't challenge that authority of the father. And so when you think about that in our political frame, you can kind of see the difference between where conservatives and liberals are. So liberals will say government should empower and protect all citizens equally. And it's fine to intervene in markets, especially if it's to correct social injustices. And we don't want to see people struggle And we're kind of okay with having 15 different social programs for all these different people. Whereas from a more conservative standpoint, the government's the strict father that doesn't help the poor, because then the poor will never learn. They'll be spoiled, right? And so you don't want to disobey the market. The market is the moral force, and it's just, that would be just like disobeying the father. And so they think that children should be free to seek out their own interests, no matter what the consequences are on others. That's part of that moral force. And if you don't win, it's because you didn't deserve to win. You didn't work hard enough, right? And so I don't think either one of us are strictly one or the other. We're really a mix of the two. But you see those, when we activate an issue with a conservative frame versus a liberal frame, it's going to speak to different people. And so when you're trying to activate a conservative, you want to rely on things like purity, light, and beauty. When you want to activate a liberal, you want to talk about equality, empathy, and diversity. And if I go talk to a conservative about equality, empathy, and diversity, they're just not really going to get that engaged, because that's not the frame that they're using. And I want to use this example of marriage equality. So this is Hawaii, 1993. I support marriage equality in Hawaii. That's great. This is a liberal frame, right? Like equality, we like equality. It wasn't going anywhere with conservatives. And in fact, some of the next subsequent elections, conservatives ran on being opposed to gay marriage, right? And it wasn't really until the linguists got involved and said, well, what if we talk about it with the freedom to marry? And we said, well, let's get government out of the decision of who you can and can't marry. And so they started kind of appealing to those conservative frames and saying, well, how can we, appeal to those conservative frames and maybe get more people into our movements? And I think we really need to do that with climate change. We need to think about, well, how do we talk about climate change as something that impacts it's not just a liberal issue, but it's a everyone issue? How do we talk about this with a conservative frame and bring more people into this movement and more people into those discussions? And there's so many positions that all of us need to fill in and work on, that it's just a really exciting place to be.
Fantastic. Thank you. And we've got time for a couple of questions, if you can catch your breath. And the first, or one with it, is how does all this relate to the Salish Sea, tying it back to our talk? And obviously, you're going back to Olympia. Are there specific issues? I guess I would expand the question. Are there specific issues affecting climate change, affecting the Salish Sea? And are there initiatives or regulations or cap and trades or policies that we are working on to help?
Yeah, so I think climate change is one of the top issues that's facing the world, but also the Salish Sea as well, right? So when we look at ocean acidification, when we look at the upwelling, when we think about salmon and salmon restoration and how are we going to get salmon going forward, climate change has to be a part of that discussion and a recognition of climate change and solutions there. It's hard to find an issue that climate change doesn't touch, but it's certainly one that's impacting the Salish Sea. As we go forward in Olympia, our caucus, I'm a Democrat and I'm in the House of Representatives. So there's the House Democratic Caucus, there's a Republican House Caucus, and there's 2 more on the Senate. We've restricted the number of bills. We're going to try and focus on 4 issues, and that's COVID-19, economic recovery, racial justice, and the coming climate crisis, right? So that's certainly going to be a focus during this remote session. We're doing this because it's harder to pass bills remotely. It's a little bit slower, so we're trying to focus our efforts. And so there's a number of policies that we're going to be looking at. We're going to be looking at fuels. There's a renewable fuel standards that tries to get at some of the CO2 emissions from transportation. There's also a couple of carbon proposals. There's a carbon tax for transportation fuels. I've been working on a carbon tax that's a recovery bond. I'll talk about that in a second. And then there's at least 2 cap and trade systems that are being floated around as well. The one that I'm working on, as an economist, I think you can do a great job with a carbon tax or a cap and trade system. They start to look really similar to each other once you start to really work on the policy. They start to look really similar and they start to have some of the benefits of both, a well-crafted one. But one of the things that we can do with a carbon tax is that we can bond it. And the number one issue that people wanted to talk to me about this summer was economic recovery. And it didn't matter if you were a conservative or a liberal, people wanted to see us invest in economic recovery and get Washingtonians back to work. And the state doesn't have a whole lot of options in terms of borrowing money and economic recovery. We have a debt limit. We can only borrow so much money. We're not like the federal government that can just print checks. But we're working on a financial instrument that would allow us to invest, that would bond some future revenue, so money that will pay off in the future, that would be paid off with a carbon tax, and that would only be able to be invested in things that help us address the coming climate crisis. So green transportation, affordable housing. We would be able to pay the part of it that gets the incremental cost to get us to net zero, but also things that are really politically popular. One of those is high-speed internet access. High-speed internet access allows for commute trip reduction, and it's also essential for building the smart grid that we know we need, because that grid has to be able to talk two ways, and so it needs better internet connections. And so I think that if you can make climate change, it's a way of turning what has been a partisan issue into something that is something that everyone wants. Everyone wants economic recovery. We know we have to pay it back somehow, that money we borrow. And I don't think it matters a whole lot to people if we pay it back as a property tax or as we pay it back as a carbon tax. It's a great thing to be able to borrow up against.
Yeah. Another question, and it's kind of almost out of order, but the person was asking, there's been a couple of carbon tax initiatives that have been shot down recently for different kinds of reasons. Given the political divides, how do we get any of all that good stuff through? It's got to pass, right? And are you optimistic?
Yeah. So the question is always, what's going to happen with a referendum, right? Like we don't want to have, like, even if we could pass it in the legislature, we're worried that a citizens group might come and put it on the ballot and say, now that people have to vote for it. And so the way that we've been working on this one is, I joke that it's referendum proof if we spend it on things that are politically popular, and we're able to bring those revenues forward. Because when you talk to voters about, voters are busy, right? Like, voters don't have a whole lot of time to delve into every question. Sometimes when there's too many questions, before I was a legislator, I'd be like, oh my gosh, why are you making me think this hard, right? Like, don't I pay people to do that work? I think that if you can bring the benefits forward and you're not focused on, do you just want this new tax and who knows what we're going to spend it on, I think that changes the calculus. And it also changes the calculus when we start talking about this as an economic recovery instrument. Because one of the things that I think some of the constraints that I didn't understand well when I was just an economist are that we don't just have to be cost effective and have a carbon policy that work, but it also needs to be politically popular and not fall on the backs of certain disadvantaged groups. Right. And so I think that the green bond approach really starts to do that. And it becomes a tool that not just Washington State can use, but a lot of other states are in the similar situation to us, knowing that the federal government is likely to not create a right-sized economic stimulus program. There's going to be slim majorities in the Senate. Even when there were larger majorities in 2008, there wasn't enough of that stimulus to really get our economy growing. And we had a longer recession than we needed to. And so having a backup plan for Washington State, I think, is financially smart information. I think it's good policy. And it just so happens that it's something that, can help us get to that lower carbon future where we signal to businesses, this is real and you have some time to plan for it. But at some point, this carbon tax is going to be biting. And so make sure you're planning and you're getting to that point where you don't need to emit as much emissions. You're on mute, Stefan.
Thank you. We're running out of time. I mean, I apologize we've got a bunch of questions that have come in that I bet you if people emailed their House representative, maybe they can continue the conversation offline. Representative Shewmake, thank you so much for your time and your good work. Next week, a quick plug. We have Dr. Drew Harville from Cornell University talking to us on ocean outbreaks in the Salish Sea. Should be a great second talk for the series. Again, thank you very much, Sharon, and we'll let you go on to your evening now.
Bye, all. Thanks for having me.